Jerry Ullsman was a notable disruptor in the 1960s. Ullsman, who had studied with Minor White, became dissatisfied with the formalist restrictions of a single image. He began experimenting with composite printing, forming a single image from multiple negatives, and he settled on a studio practice that anticipated what was to come later with the invention of photo editing computer technology. His photographs are combinations of images brought together seamlessly, resulting in strange, surreal, visual poetry that's evocative and that brought new meanings to what photography is and should be. His images also, and I'm going to talk about this extensively in the next lecture series, imply a narrative, but one that's unknown and can only be interpreted by the viewer. For Ullsman, photographs are intellectual and sensory images. DUANE MICHALS made his living in the 1960s and 70s as a commercial photographer for magazines like Esquire and Mademoiselle, but also explored his own more artistic work, experimenting with the use of sequences and text within his images. For Michaels, using photo sequences and incorporating text was a way to examine emotion, philosophy, and the passage of time. His work from the 60s and 70s was cinematic in nature and anticipated the narrative photography that would come to prominence in the 80s and 90s. WYNN Bullock had been a contemporary in thinking and in practice with Edward Weston, but he abandoned straight photography in the early 1960s and produced a major body of work referred to as the color-light abstractions, in which he explored the idea that light is a great force at the heart of all being, perhaps, in his words, the most profound truth in the universe. When the color abstractions proved too difficult to print, Bullock returned to black and white photography, but he continued to expand his vision to create innovative images that reflected his philosophical nature and search for the essence of perception. Edmund TESKE combined a career taking portraits of artists, musicians, and entertainers in the bohemian Los Angeles of the 1940s and 50s with a prolific output of experimental photography. Having committed himself to the teachings of the Hindu philosophy Vedanta, he strove to find universal essences in his photographs, producing composite prints from negatives sandwiched together as a result. In the 1950s and 60s, these artist photographers were united by their interest in what German cultural critic Walter Benjamin, in his famous 1936 book The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, called the optic unconscious. This is the idea that photography has the ability to open up spaces that previously only existed in dreams. This idea was extremely important to artist photographers working in the 1960s and 70s and planted the seed for the conceptual art and conceptual photography that signified a true break from and movement away from modernist ideology. By 1970, challenges to photography's status as art were more or less exhausted. In the art world and in critical discourse, photography was universally considered to be a legitimate art. However, vestiges of modernist thinking were still in play. In a 1975 article in the New York Times called A Different Kind of Art, MoMA photography director John Sarkowski argued that the art of photography resides in its differences as a medium from other arts. He suggested that photography is not a good tool to realize the inventions of what he called pure imagination. His argument was a conservative one, and one that was by that point out of date. It ran contrary to the fact that in actuality, artists were flocking towards photography as a tool of artistic expression. By the mid-1970s, imaginative artistic photography was thriving across a number of different ways of working, ways that were united by the idea of the photographer as auteur, or author-director, planning and composing their images instead of merely reporting them. Artists like Jerry Ullsman, DUANE MICHALS, and Joel Peter Witkin, who we'll look at more closely in the next series, created fictional narratives. Others, like JOANN CALLIS and Cindy SHERMAN, created a theater of the self. Some, like Jim Goldberg, stretched photographic meaning with words, and many exposed flaws in the medium's documentary capabilities. Modernism and modernist ideals were in widespread collapse, owing largely to the arrival of the conceptual art movement. Conceptual art is art for which the idea or the concept behind the work is more important than the finished art object. It emerged as a practice and a movement in the 1960s, and the term usually refers to art made from the 60s to the 70s. The term concept art had been used in the early 1960s, but conceptual art as a definable movement emerged in the late 60s with Joseph Kossuth's series titled Art as Idea from 1966 to 67. This series, along with exhibitions by artists like John Baldessari and group exhibitions like Seth Sieglab's Zero Objects, Zero Painters, Zero Sculptures of 1969, reflected a growing ideas-based approach to art making. Saul LeWitt first used the term conceptual art in a 1967 article, arguing that in conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. Conceptual photography, which evolved simultaneously to and out of the conceptual art movement, simply put, is a type of photography that is staged to represent an idea. The term began being used in the 1960s, coinciding with the use of conceptual art, and described two kinds of photography. The first was photography as a deadpan way of recording performances in temporary artworks, and the second was photography as a recording of a staged idea. I'm going to talk about how conceptual art was directly responsible for narrative photography in the next lecture series, but it's important to know that the implicit concerns of conceptual art and photography, real-time, process, information, and knowledge theory, and to focus on systems and structure, left a fruitful legacy in contemporary photography. The still life works of Jan Groover, some of which we've seen before, reflect a compelling interest in structures. In the images of John Fall and Louis Baltz, we see a combination of modernist landscape photography and issues of contemporary art, the idea of intervention and human disruption into the landscape. Most importantly, the conceptual art movement opened the door for artists to ask questions about the place of images in our culture, who produces them, and who reproduces them. In the late 20th century, this questioning, which we generally refer to as postmodernism, impacted art photography in many ways. It exposed how photography was used and understood as a medium, a material, and a message, and it put forth the idea that one single author doesn't create art, but rather a work of art is the product of its context and has a multiplicity of meanings. In other words, the context of an artwork defines its meaning and our cultural understanding of it. Some artist photographers, like Richard Prince, SHERRIE LEVINE, and Barbara Kruger, explored the idea of appropriation with their photographic images. Richard Prince and SHERRIE LEVINE embraced the practice of rephotography in the 1980s. Prince rephotographed photographic images for mass media. One of his most famous pieces, Untitled or Cowboy, from 1977, is a rephotograph of a famous cigarette ad featuring the Marlboro Man. Since the late 1970s and early 80s, Richard Prince has played with the question, is this art? And I'm going to talk about him again in just a minute as I wrap up this lecture. The conceptual theory behind this work is really dense, and I probably can't make it make sense for you in the few minutes we have to talk about it. I'm sure you're thinking, what even is this, and how is this possibly art photography? It's just an ad. You know what? You're right to think that. The point is that Richard Prince is challenging you to think exactly that. What's important about this work, whether you think it's good or even art, is the idea that it has a conceptual foundation. Prince in practice is photographing an idea, and that it poses a critical challenge to the then traditional norms and definitions around what photography and art is. SHERRIE LEVINE works in a similar way, although her work asks more specifically feminist questions. She rephotographs work of famous male artists, and is probably most known for her work that involved rephotographing the work of Walker Evans from his book Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. We looked at that in our documentary lectures. Her work is important for the same reasons that Richard Prince's work is, but she adds an additional set of critical questions. If you compare her work to the work of Walker Evans, there's no discernible difference. And that's because the way photography and reproduced images work, you can't tell that they're in fact different images. So then you might ask, what's the point? Levine is in fact questioning both the male hierarchy in the art world, in a way asking why the institutions hold up male figures as being so important and influential, and the importance that the art world places on authorship over content. Evans became famous as the photographer, while history largely forgot the individual struggles of his subject. Barbara Kruger appropriates photographic images from the media and overlays them with bold text, yielding photomontages and collages in order to challenge cultural constructs of power, identity, and sexuality. Other photographers in the 80s and 90s embraced conventions of film and cinema to explore more narrative photography that questioned the very nature of reality and truth themselves. This is where we'll start when we take a look at constructed narratives in the next lecture series. But the big takeaway is that by the beginning of the 21st century and into today, we're not really asking the question, is this art, anymore? Instead, we're asking, is this photography? The digital revolution and the explosion of alternative platforms for photography, like social media, have collapsed all of the modernist boundaries of photography that were established with the hard work and advocacy of artist photographers like Alfred Stieglitz and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Art photography in the 21st century is characterized by these collapsed boundaries, by photography's multiple roles, and by the multiple contexts of and for photography today. We can see this evidence in the portraiture of Sam Taylor Johnson, particularly in her Suspended series. And we see it in the landscapes of Joel Sternfeld. This is New York City's High Line before it was redeveloped into a destination. If any of you have been there and walked it, then you see how this landscape seems almost post-apocalyptic in comparison to how it exists today. Contemporary artists shooting objects or still life images have also brought this expanded consciousness to their work, which is both inter- and multidisciplinary. Gabriel Orozco photographs installations. Wolfgang Tillmans takes pictures in order to see the world. Hiroshi Sugimoto explores photography and architecture. And Vic Muniz combines his sculpture and photography. The fashion photography of KOTO BOLOFO blurs cultural lines and barriers. And Olivo Barbieri's cityscapes take on otherworldly qualities as he experiments with perspective and scale. And even documentary photographers shooting real-life subjects do so with an expanded sense of mission and purpose. Nan Goldin explores broad LGBTQ concerns like the HIV and opioid epidemics by searching for narratives in bodies and relationships. And Boris Mikhailov has looked extensively at the long-term consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Social media poses interesting questions for the future of photography in its multiple forms. For many aspiring photographers, social media platforms are more democratic than traditional institutions of the art world, museums and galleries. They can get their work out there to a wide audience quickly, instantaneously even. But social media platforms, as you all know, can also be a source of controversy. As a final bit of food for thought, I'll leave you with Richard Prince. In 2014, Prince had an exhibition of 38 portraits at the Gagosian Gallery in New York, called New Portraits. He took each image from his Instagram feed, images of models, artists, and celebrities. He enlarged them, reproduced them, and recaptioned them with fake comments, and offered them up for sale at outrageous prices to the general public. Obviously, he's still challenging us to think about the question, is this art? Well, it turns out some of these images were those of the Suicide Girls, an online collaborative group celebrating pinup photography. Unable to challenge Prince in court, the group went to the gallery, took pictures of his reproduced pictures, which were theirs to begin with, enlarged those, reproduced those, and then offered those up for sale online at reasonable prices. So, who wins? In the next series, we'll look closely at narrative photography. Hopefully with this series, you've gained a sense of what art photography is, and the point really is that it's anything that you want it to be.